Thank you very much for your generosity and for the gift of being here in Chile. Say it again. Thank you very much. Better now? Okay. Thank you very much for your generosity and for the gift of being here in Chile and having the opportunity to reflect together with others on the issues of our time. Thank you very, very much to speak here in Valparaíso. I would like to thank especially, muchas gracias a todo el equipo de Puesto de Ideas, muchas gracias a Carolin Emcke del Goethe Institut, muchas gracias a Mauro Basaude de la Universidad y Carolina Torrealba de la Universidad en Santiago. I will continue though in English, but if there's questions later, I can speak in Spanish. Ariel Dorfman writes in The Suicide Museum, I quote, "Like so much else in my country, Valparaíso contained a multitude of contradictions. It was the birthplace of Salvador Allende, the port he had always called home, where he first learned of the sufferings of his people, where he had first vowed to heal those wounds. But it was also the city where Augusto Pinochet had been born and grown up, the city the dictator loved so dearly that he had insisted on housing parliament there and had erected a monstrous building worthy of Mussolini, dreaming that in that building he would be consecrated as ruler for life, but had instead been forced to hand over to the reins of Alwyn. A dramatic end and reversal to what had begun when the military, from that very Valparaíso, had launched a coup that would turn one of the native sons of that city into a tyrant and the other one into a corpse. I cannot speak here without thinking of the contradictions, and I think it is one of the most difficult tasks of our present time, in particular here in Chile, not to forget the history of our places, our cities, our societies, the dark and the bright stages in it, in order to still be able to distinguish between them, because that determines whether we know how to distinguish between right and wrong, true and false, just and unjust in the present. So there could be no better place than Valparaíso to ask how our democracies are being threatened and attacked, and what role hatred and resentment, lies and disinformation play in it. Prelude. Why do we need to analyze hatred and resentment? Why bother with it at all? Let me begin with a personal anecdote. My grandmother was the best grandmother in the world. She drove like a maniac, played cards passionately, and smoked unfiltered cigarettes. We were allowed to bring home any animal we found in the woods or fields. She let us stay up late, and on the promise that we wouldn't tell our parents, let us watch Muhammad Ali box Joe Frazier. She lovingly comforted us when we were sad and patiently nursed us when we were ill. She was adventurous and she was generous. There was only one thing my beloved grandmother simply couldn't stand, and that was bad moods. She was strict about that. If you grumbled or whined for hours, my grandmother would grab you by the neck like a cat, gently but firmly, and say, "I think you should go outside and play for a while. When you feel better, you can come back in. And just like that, you were out the door. My grandmother simply considered bad moods to be rude. It was not proper to burden others with your own dissatisfaction or even blame them for it. I remember well how I then trudged outside, loitered around indecisively for a moment, but soon explored the area so happily that hours later I usually no longer thought about that I hadn't really gone out that voluntarily. To this day, I consider bad moods to be ill-mannered and unreasonable. And to this day, I occasionally think that some people would do well to just go outside and play a little. Perhaps this also explains my initial discomfort with dealing with right-wing populist movements and parties. What is articulated there on the streets or online, in election campaigns or on television, in analog protests and digital flash mobs, would have seemed rude to my grandmother. And she would have found it absurd to respond to it. Just because someone is angry, just because someone is acting defiantly, there is no reason to pretend that there is an excuse or even valid reason for it. In the novel Anil's Ghost, Canadian author Michael Ondaatje describes a plant that grows in deserts. When just a little water touches its leaves, the smell of creosote wafts through the air. The shrub secretes the poison as soon as it rains, as if this would keep other bushes away. Public discourse has been like that little plant. In order to gain even a little of political or media attention, mistrust and resentment towards others are secreted. Lies and disinformation are spread to belittle and hurt others. In this process, a kind of exhibitionism of cold-heartedness has spread, proudly and shamefully revealing what would rather remain hidden in terms of social stinginess and ethical impotence. I am and remain my grandmother's granddaughter. I still think that those who perforate our societies with their endless stuttering and shouting, who use their hatred and resentment to transform our democracies into authoritarian orders, I still think that their followers, their henchmen, their agitators should simply be shown the door. Instead, they are trivialized, coddled, misunderstood, and thus able to reach for power. Almost 10 years ago, in 2016, I published the German version of Against Hate, Contra, odio, an analysis of the power of hate and resentment, which, at the time, I could not have imagined would prove so accurate in predicting the radicalization and brutalization of social discourse worldwide. When the text was published, you may remember, in 2016, Donald Trump had not yet been elected. The right-wing extremist AfD in Germany had not yet been elected to parliament. Jair Bolsonaro was still a congressman in Rio de Janeiro. Javier Milei did not even have his own radio show, but was still working for Corporación América Airports. Johannes Kaiser was still with his YouTube channel. José Antonio Cast was, you all know better than I do, in any case, far from his ambitions for the presidency. When the text was published, X was still called Twitter. There was Facebook and Instagram, but no TikTok. It took only 10 years to normalize hatred and resentment. It took only 10 years to divide democratic societies and discredit principles of equality, with a narrative of the past, with a dogma of national cultural purity, with the ideology of authoritarianism. It took only 10 years to establish hatred and resentment as a political currency that everyone, strangely, takes for granted, that is no longer to be questioned or criticized, but is accepted as supposed anthropological constant. Today, I would first like to take apart the hatred and resentment politically and rhetorically, describe the producers and profiteers of hatred, and finally develop strategies of resistance and defense for politics of dignity. Hatred. Hate is imprecise, hate is hot, hate is obsessive. Hate is imprecise. It is difficult to hate precisely. Precision would bring delicacy, careful observation, or listening. Precision would bring the differentiation that recognizes the individual person with their diverse, contradictory characteristics and inclinations as a human being. But once individuality is denied, once all difference and diversity is negated, all that remains are blurred, uniform collectives against which hatred and resentment can be unleashed. Hatred is always convenient. Hatred makes things easy. Hatred does not want to deal with the real, actual people or groups, with real, actual causes of problems. It wants to hate unrestrainedly, and for that it needs blurred collectives. The migrants, the women, the indigenous peoples, the unemployed, the homeless, the woke, or even the politicians, the media, the intellectuals. For libertarians, it is also often more abstract, the state, the bureaucracy. Hatred always moves upwards or downwards, always along a vertical axis, never, ever at eye level. One's own position, one's own we, is always either persecuted and oppressed by a supposedly powerful they, or one's own we, one's own position is exalted, distinguished, better, purer than a supposedly disruptive, sick, inferior, criminal, perverse they. They are those up there or those down there. In any case, a categorical other that is fantasized as a danger to the community. This not only justifies subsequent mistreatment or disenfranchisement, but also prepares the ground for the removal of the disruptive, dangerous, foreign body as a political, patriotic, national duty. The subsequent violence is rhetorically disguised as purification, healing, salvation, protection. Hate is a hot feeling, not a cold emotion. Hate is felt in a state of intoxication, not sobriety. This is what distinguishes hate from contempt. Unlike disgust or fear, hate does not seek to create distance between itself and the object of hate. The hater does not shy away from proximity to the hated, but seeks out the object, wants to wrest and destroy it. However, this does not mean that hatred simply exists. Hatred is not natural. Hatred does not suddenly erupt, but it is cultivated. The hatred we experience in our present day is as little individual as it is random. Hatred is steered up. There are publicists and authors, social media influencers and TV stations, political parties and their staff, political advisors and communications agencies, bots and algorithms. They do not have to hate themselves. They let others hate. They can afford to simply incite hatred. They are the profiteers of hatred. They reap what hatred brings them: ratings, votes, economic gains, symbolic or financial or political power. They control the emotion machine. They program the logic of escalation. They write the fascist narratives. They exploit feelings of insecurity, feelings of powerlessness, loneliness, social unease, and direct them at the opponent they want. Nothing about hatred, nothing about resentment is natural. Nothing about it is genuine. Hatred is artificial, and it is directed. The mass hatred of Eastern European migrants in England before the Brexit vote is as little accidental as the hatred of Muslim immigrants in France, the hatred of trans people in Europe or the US or Latin America. The resentment of migrants here in the current discourse is also not accidental. It is not simply a vague feeling that erupts spontaneously. Rather, hatred is ideologically shaped, rhetorically prepared, and requires narrative and visual patterns into which it can be channeled. The terms in which women, or poor people, or migrants, or trans can be stigmatized as others, the chains of association in which convicted criminals are portrayed as inhuman or monsters, the chains of association in which women are interpreted as servile beings without autonomous freedom of choice over their own bodies, or conversely, as sluts, the chains of association in which one's own history of violence is denied, is whitewashed, or even the violence of the junta is justified. All these patterns of perception must be prepared and shaped so that hatred can be unleashed on the desired objects. Hate and violence must always be viewed structurally in the conditions that enable them. And that also means making visible the contexts of prior justification or subsequent approval. Looking at the various sources that feed hate or violence in a specific case. Women are not simply beaten to death by their husbands or partners. Women are not simply subordinated to the will of men or the Catholic Church without rights. This requires conventions, traditions, and habits that are taught and passed on in families, in schools, in courts, at police stations, in political programs, in religious services, in school books. Violence does not simply happen. It is prepared. The direction in which hatred and violence are unleashed, the targets they are directed against, the thresholds and obstacles that must be removed, none of this is accidental. The public, yes, I agree with you, whoever was making that noise, shall speak a little bit quieter. The public prosecutor's office and the police are responsible for certain forms of hatred and violence. But for the forms of exclusion and restriction, for the small techniques of segregation, for all the gestures and practices of humiliation, for the mechanics of disintegration, for all the ways in which people in need, people who are defamed, people who are suddenly to receive less protection, people who are suddenly to be regarded as strangers, whose bodies, whose way of believing, whose way of loving, whose way of living are suddenly to be regarded as less belonging, as less worthy of protection. For all these kinds of creeping dehumanization, we are all responsible. Second, narrative masks. Whether it is libertarian, authoritarian, or fascist ambitions, whether it is right-wing extremists or right-wing reactionary figures and movements that want to undermine our democracy and our humanism, whether it is in Hungary or Russia, in the US or Italy, or here in Chile, they all operate with a rhetorical masquerade. They all have grand narratives in which they present themselves as the ultimate doers, the ultimate solution, the ultimate voice of the people. They stir up fear. They want to claim that the present is a state of emergency. They paint a bleak picture in which gangs dominate. They see a war looming, a state of emergency in which special measures, special harshness, special radicalism will be necessary. Their narratives are narratives. Their political programs are fiction. Their closeness to the people and their underdog self-image are fiction. They are rhetorical masquerades, a carnival of contempt for humanity, incidentally mostly for the very social groups they claim to represent. What they all share is their contempt for the idea of equality. What they all share is the rejection of a universal humanity, the rejection of civil rights guarantees of the law, the aversion to the promises of the Enlightenment, the principles of self-critical scientific thinking. What they share is an undermining of the welfare state, of the community that feels responsible for all its members. They prefer a form of social Darwinism. What they all share is a re-hierarchization of society, an anti-democratic order that prioritizes the lifestyles, bodies, beliefs, and sexuality of some, while denigrating those of others. The others are then at least somewhat less recognized as belonging. Their beliefs deserve somewhat less religious freedom or none at all. Their civil rights are somewhat less guaranteed or arbitrarily revoked. Their bodies are considered somewhat less worthy of protection or completely negated. Their stories become somewhat less audible or visible or completely banned. The others are either made invisible or monstrously visible. It is about re-hierarchizing people and their value. One need only glance at the list of banned terms in the United States. These are words that may no longer be used by public authorities, which had to be deleted from websites and internal or external document and replaced by others. So the words that are prohibited in the US, among others, are accessible, bias, community, equality, inclusion, injustice, minority, stereotypes. Imagine writing text without these words. It is as absurd as it is consistent. All terms that could in any way be helpful in describing a pluralistic society, all terms that could in any way be useful in criticizing injustice, discrimination, and inequality, all terms that could in any way be touching, because they find words for treating each other with dignity, all these terms are banned under President Trump. In this way, the language of understanding, the vocabulary of community, the dictionary of solidarity and coexistence is gradually being destroyed. And that is the ambition, to shatter the idea, the concept, the practice of equality among people and to establish hierarchies. Libertarian, authoritarian, or fascist movements and regimes around the world may differ in their cultural or religious references. They may be Muslim or Catholic, Russian Orthodox or evangelical, but they are united by their unconditional contempt for all people who live queer or trans lives. They are united by the unconditional biologization of gender, by binary thinking, by the belief that everything that is changeable, open, hybrid, must be denied or criminalized. That explains also why migrants who are transitioning are often targeted and criminalized. This is what unites Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, what unites Erdogan and Bolsonaro. They only want to support certain women, promote certain families, defend a certain concept of the people, a certain nation. They only want to see a certain faith legitimized, tolerate only a certain way of life as appropriate. Everything else is claimed to be unnatural, foreign, elitist, cosmopolitan, not from here, not real, not truly Chilean. They want to determine what is considered normal, which people, which standards, and exclude everything else as abnormal. But that is what narratives of hatred and resentment do. They transform our society. They transform our humanity into hierarchies in which some are granted fewer rights, less access, less protection. Their narratives are narratives. They are fictions, and they always contain the same motifs. They always employ the same tactical maneuvers. They repeat themselves in their demagogic structure. They want to appeal to some kind of past, a past in which the nation was still imperial or homogeneous or pious, in which the separation of powers was not yet taken so seriously, in which the Geneva Conventions did not apply, in which it was still permissible to abuse or torture prisoners without shame, a past in which the junta ruled, or the Tsar, or some unchallenged authority. They appeal to a past in which masculinity still meant something, in which criminals were dealt with swiftly, in which the welfare state did not offer so much support to the poor, in which a more anarchistic survival of the fittest prevailed. An imaginary past, in which the traditional heterosexual family with its order still meant something. At the same time, in recent years, they combine paradoxically the appeal to the past with a techno-futurist phantasma All human weaknesses, illnesses, flaws shall be erased. The perfect model, non-human human shall reign. They come up with different historical, cultural, or religious references, but it doesn't matter whether they themselves share these references. Convicted sex offenders can claim to be Christian. Tax evaders can claim to be patriotic. It's the magic of the shamelessness. Almost all right-wing populists or radical parties in Europe, almost all figures of authoritarianism who claim to be anti-establishment are driven by people from the upper middle class, educated at private schools. They may be professors, hedge fund managers, or real estate moguls. They come from middle-class families. Their parents were officers or meat manufacturers, diplomats or tax advisors. Rarely, very rarely, are they children of the working class. Rarely, very rarely, are they underprivileged people who pretend to know the hardships of the socially disadvantaged. That alone would not even be the worst thing. Marx and Engels, Michel Foucault and Hannah Arendt did not come from working class backgrounds either. If only they at least made policies for those they rhetorically puff themselves up for. They may differ in their references, but they are united by their recourse to authoritarianism, which despises civil and women's rights. They are united by racism, which constructs the other in a way that suits the respective society. They are united by their contempt for critical, independent thinking, whether in journalism or in the sciences. They are united by their attack of the welfare state. They are united by their mercilessness. They are united by their lack of compassion, their ruthlessness, no matter how Christian they may dress themselves up as. In doing so, they take whatever is currently virulent as social unrest in society. The topic is irrelevant. They are flexible in this regard. It could be COVID, it could be security and crime, it doesn't matter. The problems and concerns can be real or invented, it doesn't matter. They are solely interested in exploiting emotions. Real social, economic, and political problems do not interest right-wing agitators. They do not want to solve them. They want to amplify and channel emotions. Crime and security? X is to blame. Drug violence? X is to blame. Unemployment? X is to blame. Rising energy prices? X is to blame. They don't want to examine the real causes of social discontent. They just want to exaggerate it. It's about posturing, not politics. It's all, in the end, a theater. They want to live on as figures that thrive on spectacle, on chainsaws or baseball caps. They are simulators of politics, but above all, they are performers who don't just want to appear on stage. They never want to leave it. They want to blur the lines between theater and reality, between true and false, invented and real, lies and knowledge. It's travesty. 3, mechanisms of discourse subversion. The digital distribution machine of hatred and resentment, of lies and disinformation is global and totalitarian. They are called tech oligarchs because they hold monopolies, whether it's Zuckerberg's Facebook, Meta, or Elon Musk's X. But they are, above all, oligarchs of disinformation with an omnipotent contempt for truth and public spirit. What was once naively celebrated as democratic public discourse What was touted as participatory social media has developed into nihilistic dystopia. Women and other marginalized groups are the primary victims of the increasingly rapid and radicalizing discourse on Twitter or Instagram. Hate is systematically steered up at an ever-increasing pace and with ever greater abandonment of people. Individual fragments of sentences, individual misfortunes, individual words are taken out of context and distorted. Anything that can be used to cause excitement or ridicule, anything that can be used for malice and incitement to violence is distributed. Anything that ends in hatred, anything that ends in violence, follows a predetermined path. There are those who start the frenzy with a meme, an image, a snippet. They don't even need to get worked up themselves. They just feed it in, relying on triggers and digital escalation machines. They are the choreographers of hate. They make others dance to hatred. The algorithms reward excitement. The algorithms fuel and promote everything that escalates discourse. That is the built-in logic. Algorithms condition and produce anger. They sort the angry together. They arrange similar emotions and positions in relations to each other, thus distorting the world into a uniformly closed worldview. Counter strategies and error prevention. So what can be done? First of all, we can learn from the mistakes of democratic movements, the mistakes of media actors, and the mistakes of political parties in other countries. If you love classical music, if you go to concerts, you know that there is a preparatory beat in conducting. Before every musical action, there is the so-called preparatory beat. This is basically the most important beat of all. It prepares for musical action or initiates it. This means that when executed well, the conductor or choir director can ensure that the orchestra or choir starts together precisely. Translated into politics and applied to the present, there is a preparatory beat for all countries that now have right-wing candidates. Here in Chile, you have a preparatory beat, just as we have one in Europe. We can see what Bolsonaro has done and how he has acted. We can see what Milei or Trump are doing and how they are acting. We can see how they are demolishing the constitutional state, how they are undermining the welfare state, how they are taking away legal rights of migrants, how they want to deny and rewrite what is historically true in schools, in museums, and in universities. We can see how they're trying to control the free press, how they're pitting people and groups against each other. And we see how slowly the opposition is forming, how quickly conformity is taking place. We see the mistakes the media are making, the mistakes the parties are making, out of fear, out of opportunism, out of ignorance. I would like to therefore point out some mistakes in the time that I still have that I think we should avoid. First, media normalization. The reflexive softening of fascist demagogy or authoritarian chauvinistic movements is by no means, only in the United States, responsible for their excesses and violence, but also elsewhere. For years, the media avoided recognizing right-wing extremist ideology as a real danger within and emanating from the core of democracy. Whether out of economic calculation, so as not to alienate readers or viewers, or out of party political tactics, so as to not scare away voters, or out of sheer resentment, appeasement towards anti-democratic movements was part of the repertoire of opportunism that forgot history. Historical crimes of the juntas in Latin America or the fascists in Europe or slavery in the United States are trivialized or celebrated. Efforts to come to terms with the past are called into question. Human and civil rights achievements are dismantled again, and out of fear of naming what is reappearing as a zombie of the past. Under the fig leaf of neutrality, untruth and contempt for humanity were repeatedly presented as positions that should be taken seriously and reported. Critical voices, on the other hand, were denounced as elitist or politically correct, allegedly failing to understand the concerns and needs of the normal people. Second, false opposites. Populist discourse likes to suggest that one's own party or movement is concerned with the real problems, the real needs. It suggests that everyone else has focused only on trivialities, only on minority rights, only on marginal issues. Interestingly enough, women then always count as a minority. Interesting enough, schools and education always count as trivial. Interestingly, civil rights only count as marginal. Populist discourse likes to suggest that one's party is concerned with the honest tasks, the tough issues, crime, gang violence, the economy. It is pretended that a political choice must be made between security and the rule of law, between economic stability and political and cultural recognition. It is pretended that respect is something one must be able to afford, that respect and equal rights are something one takes care of once all other social issues have been addressed. There's a railing against wokeness, against identity politics, while one's own close circles and identity politics of Catholic reactionary milieus are masked as somehow neutral. That is absurd. We must dispel these false dichotomies. There are no main concerns that need to be taken seriously and secondary concerns that can be postponed, ridiculed, or put on hold. You can be in favor of security and reduction of crime and still recognize the value of migrants and respect their rights. Feminist debates are not luxury debates. The debate about racism and chauvinism, about homophobic and transphobic laws and beliefs is not a secondary discussion that can only be addressed once all other problems have been solved. There is no prioritization of whose human and civil rights should be enforced first. There is no social and economic hardship of the majority on the one hand and cultural hardships of minorities, indigenous people, black people, migrants, women, queer, disabled, and elderly people on the other. Respect is not something that can be postponed. Respect is reasonable, always. And leave no one behind. Anti-authoritarian, anti-democratic movements can only be resisted if we do not protect ourselves, if we do not abandon the weakest, if we defend the rule of law, even if it is difficult, if we defend ways of life, even if they're foreign to us, if we are equally committed to the freedom of the devout and atheists, if we do not associate ourselves with hatred and resentment. This requires that the focus is no longer on those who stir up fear, incite anger, and channel hatred, but on those who are at their mercy. I know I'm running out of time, so just try to be brief with my final remarks. What can be done? be in love with success. Progressive forces must also believe in their own convictions and their own visions. Democracy cannot be defended bashfully. Democracy can only be defended passionately, with joy, with wit, with conviction. Those who want to defend democracy against the onslaught of authoritarianism must not cover, must not shy away from alienating anyone. Those who want to defend democracy must not only address hardship, must not only address fears, must not only address social and economic pain, they must also tell stories of happiness. Without images and languages of hope, without a vocabulary of dignity and solidarity, we will not drive away the spirits of authoritarianism, anti-democracy, and fascism. We are the normal people. Thank you.